Love isn't a fairy tale. It's a transaction signed in ink and sealed with hypocrisy. But when Christian fled his own wedding, leaving his family name in the gutter, the stoic Duke of Westfall stepped into the chapel's shadows, unaware that the cynical bride had been praying for this exact betrayal. The letter smelled of cheap gin and orange flower water. It was crumpled at the edges, stained with a greasy thumbprint that Arthur Pendleton recognized instantly. His younger brother, Christian, had always left his mark in things by ruining them. Arthur, the Duke of Westfall, stood in the damp, drafty vestry of St. Jude's Chapel, his heavy wool coat still damp from the November mist. Outside, the bells were already chiming the quarter hour. In 15 minutes, 300 members of the ton would expect a wedding. They would expect to see Christian, charming, golden-haired, useless Christian, stand at the altar and rescue the Linden family from their looming financial ruin by marrying their eldest daughter. Instead, Arthur was holding a farewell note. "Arthur," the scrawl read, "I cannot do it. She is a stone. Looking at her is like looking at a ledger. I've taken the mare and headed for Dover. Celine waits for me in Paris. Do not follow. Tell the Lindens I am dead if it saves your precious pride." Arthur squeezed his eyes shut. The aeon, a sharp, rhythmic pulsing, began behind his left temple. For 5 years since their father died and left Arthur with a crumbling dukedom and a brother who treated the family treasury like a personal dice cup, Arthur had cleaned up the messes. He had paid off the opera dancers. He had settled the vowels at White's. He had bought back the family silver twice. But this was a public execution of 2 reputations. The door to the vestry banged open, rattling the iron latch. Lord Thomas Linden stumbled in, his cravat slightly askew, a sheen of sweat coating his florid, aristocratic face. The man smelled of panic and the brandy he had undoubtedly sneaked from his flask. "Westfall," Linden wheezed, gripping the back of an oak chair. "The guests are filling the pews. The bishop is getting impatient. Where's the boy? My daughter is sitting in the carriage like a sacrificial lamb, and your brother is nowhere to be found." Arthur did not flinch. He carefully folded the note and slid it into his waistcoat pocket. "Christian is not coming, Lord Thomas." The older man froze. The ruddy color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking gray, old, and suddenly very fragile. "What do you mean, not coming? The contracts are signed. The settlements are agreed upon. My collieries, the debts." "He has fled to the continent," Arthur said, his voice flat, devoid of the fury that was currently burning a hole in his stomach. "With an actress. He has no intention of returning." Linden sank into the chair, his head dropping into his hands. A dry, choking sob escaped him. "We are ruined. The papers will have this by tomorrow morning. Amelia. God, Amelia will be a laughingstock. No one will touch her after being jilted by a younger son. We lose the house in Mayfair. We lose everything." Arthur watched the man break. He felt a cold, familiar detachment settle over him. He had spent his life being the responsible one, the shadow duke who worked the land, balanced the books, and spoke only when spoken to. Christian had been the light, the one everyone loved, the one who danced with the ladies while Arthur sat in the library with the bottles of port and the land deeds. And then there was Amelia Linden. Arthur looked out the small, grimy window of the vestry toward the courtyard where the Linden carriage sat. He could see the dark outline of her profile through the frosted glass. He remembered her from the negotiation dinners, while Christian had spent those evenings flirting with Amelia's younger sister, or complaining about the quality of the mutton. Amelia had sat quietly, observing the room with a pair of sharp, intelligent gray eyes that seemed to see through every bit of society nonsense. Once, when Christian had made a particularly foolish comment about the tenant farmers, Amelia's eyes had met Arthur's across the table. There had been a brief, silent understanding between them, a shared weariness of the world's performative theater. Arthur had spent the last 6 months dreaming of her. It was a pathetic, silent sort of love, the kind that grows in the dark like moss on stone. He had accepted that she would belong to his brother. He had resigned himself to being the brother-in-law who managed her allowance and ensured she never went hungry while Christian squandered her dowry. There is an alternative, Arthur said. The words left his mouth before his brain could fully process the madness of them. Lord Thomas looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. An alternative? What alternative? He's gone. The contract specifies a marriage between the House of Pendleton and the House of Linden, Arthur said, his voice dropping into that low, authoritative register that made estate managers tremble. It names Christian as the groom because he was available and required a settling influence. But the title, the wealth, and the security reside with me. Linden stared at him, his mouth opening slightly. But you are the Duke. Precisely. The alliance remains intact. Your debts will be cleared by noon tomorrow. Your daughter will not be a laughingstock. She will be a duchess. The tongue will whisper, yes. They will wonder why the swap was made at the 11th hour. But they will not mock a Duchess of Westfall. And Amelia, Linden whispered. She expects Christian. Go to the carriage, Arthur commanded, pulling out his pocket watch. The hands were ticking mercilessly. Tell her the truth. Give her the choice. If she says no, I will walk out there and take the blame for the wedding's cancellation myself. But if she says yes, tell her to meet me at the altar in 5 minutes. The air inside the carriage was suffocatingly hot, thick with the scent of dried lavender and the stale anxiety of her maid, who was currently weeping into a handkerchief in the corner. Amelia Linden sat perfectly still. Her spine did not touch the leather backrest. Her hands, encased in white kid-skin gloves, lay folded in her lap like two dead birds. Her dress was an expensive monstrosity of heavy white satin and lace that her mother had insisted upon. A dress meant to scream to London that the Lindens still had money, even if they had to sell their eldest daughter to get it. She didn't love Christian. She wasn't a fool. Christian was a handsome animal, with the intellect of a spaniel and the moral fortitude of a weather vane. She had agreed to marry him because her father had cried in her sitting room, begging her to save the family from the debtor's prison. She had accepted her fate with the cold, hard pragmatism that had defined her entire life. Marriage was not about happiness, it was about survival. But when her father opened the carriage door, his face white and his breath coming in ragged gasps, she knew the survival plan had hit a rock. "Amelia," her father said, his voice cracking. "Out! Everyone out!" The maid scrambled out of the carriage, leaving Amelia alone with her father. The old man took her gloved hands in his. They were shaking. "He's gone, isn't he?" Amelia asked. Her voice was steady, shockingly so. She felt a strange, dark sense of vindication. She had known Christian was a coward. She had only misjudged the timing of his cowardice. "Christian fled to France," her father managed to say. "The boy has left us to the wolves, Amelia. The scandal. We are finished." Amelia looked down at her white gloves. "Then we go home, father. We pack the trunks and we move to a cottage in Wales. We survive it." "No," her father whispered, a desperate gleam entering his eyes. "No, there is another way. Westfall is here, Arthur." Amelia's heart gave a sudden violent thud against her ribs, a single heavy stroke that made her breath catch. "The Duke? He has offered to take Christian's place. He will marry you today. Right now. He says the contract can stand under his name. He will pay the debts, Amelia. You will be the Duchess." Her father's fingers tightened around hers, bruising her through the leather. "He is waiting at the altar. He said it is your choice, but God help us, girl. If you say no, we have nothing." Amelia turned her head to look out the window. The gray November rain was beginning to fall in earnest now, spotting the stone walls of the church. Arthur, the silent, brooding Duke who always smelled of tobacco and damp earth. The man who had sat in her father's study for hours, methodically going through the ruined ledgers with a grim expression, never offering a word of pity, only solutions. She had spent hours watching him from across rooms. While Christian had been loud and colorful, Arthur had been a dark, solid presence, like an old oak tree that stayed put while the storm raged around it. She remembered 3 weeks ago, during a dinner at Westfall House. She had dropped her reticule, and Arthur had bent down to retrieve it at the same moment she did. Their fingers had brushed. It was a fraction of a second, but she had felt a jolt of heat so intense it had frightened her. When she looked up, his dark eyes had been fixed on her face with a look of such raw, suppressed hunger that she had forgotten how to breathe. Then he had blinked, masked it behind his usual stony indifference, handed her the bag, and walked away. She had thought he disliked her. She had thought he viewed her as another piece of bad business his brother had dragged into the family. "Amelia," her father pleaded. "The bells have stopped. People are whispering." Amelia pulled her hands away from her father's grip. She smoothed the heavy satin of her skirt. Her mind was working with a cold, terrifying clarity. If she married Christian, she would have spent her life managing a boy king, watching him cheat on her, watching him gamble away what little they had left. If she married Arthur, she would be marrying a man, a dangerous, silent man whom she did not understand, but whose presence filled her with a strange, dark electricity that she couldn't name. "Tell the bishop to begin," Amelia said. Her voice didn't shake. "And father, do not look so miserable. You wanted a Pendleton. You've simply got the better one." The walk down the aisle of St. Jude's was an exercise in public humiliation, masquerading as a holy sacrament. The whispers began the moment she passed the first row of pews. The Ton had eyes. They knew Christian's height, his posture, his bright gold hair. The man standing at the altar was broader in the shoulders, his hair a dark, rich brown, his posture so rigid he looked as though he had been carved out of the church's foundation stones. Amelia kept her chin high, her gaze fixed entirely on the back of the priest's robes. She refused to look at the guests. She could feel their eyes like needles against her skin. "Look at the Linden girl," they were surely saying. "Her groom ran, so she took the brother. Any duke will do for a bankrupt's daughter." As she reached the steps of the altar, her father let go of her arm. He retreated into the shadows, looking like a man who had just escaped the gallows. Amelia took her place at the altar. Finally, she turned her head and looked at the man beside her. Arthur was dressed in a dark blue coat that fitted his broad frame with an exactness that Christian's clothes never had. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a small muscle twitched in his cheek. He didn't look at her immediately. He stared straight ahead at the golden cross behind the altar. But then, as the priest cleared his throat and opened his book, Arthur turned his head. His eyes were incredibly dark, nearly black in the dim candlelight of the chapel. There was no pity in them. There was no triumph. There was only a profound, heavy gravity that seemed to pull the air from her lungs. "Are you certain of this, Miss Linden?" he murmured, his voice so low that it didn't travel past the first step of the altar. It is a bit late for cold feet, Your Grace," she whispered back, her lips barely moving. "Unless you wish to join your brother on the ferry to Calais." A ghost of a smile, sharp, cynical, and entirely fleeting, touched the corner of his mouth. "Not today." The Bishop of London had seen many things in his 40 years in the church, but he had never seen a wedding that felt so much like a court-martial. He looked between the Duke and Amelia, his fingers trembling slightly against the vellum pages of his prayer book. He knew the names on the license did not match the man standing before him, but a glance from Arthur Pendleton was enough to convince any sensible man that God's law could be flexible when a dukedom was at stake. "Dearly beloved," the bishop began, his voice echoing off the cold stone walls. The ceremony passed in a blur of Latin phrases and heavy rhythmic responses. When it came time for Arthur to speak his vows, his voice did not hesitate. It filled the chapel, deep and absolute, carrying a weight that made the whispers in the pews die out completely. He spoke the words not like a man making a romantic promise, but like a sovereign signing a treaty. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death us do part. When he placed the ring on her finger, Amelia realized it was not the dainty modern diamond Christian had chosen for her. It was a massive old-fashioned gold band set with a dark sapphire. The Westfall family ring taken straight from Arthur's own pinky finger. It was heavy, and it was cold. His hand was rougher than her brother's would have been. He had small scars across his knuckles from an accident with a carriage wheel 3 winters ago. His grip was firm, holding her fingers with a steady pressure that felt less like a romantic gesture and more like an anchor. "I will," Amelia said when her turn came. She looked him dead in the eye as she said it. She wanted him to see that she wasn't frightened of him. She wanted him to know that she was entering this bargain with her eyes wide open. The signing of the register in the vestry was done in complete silence. Lord Thomas signed as a witness, with fingers that left ink smudges on the paper. And when Arthur took the quill, he crossed out Christian's name with a single brutal stroke of black ink and wrote Arthur Philip Pendleton, Duke of Westfall, above it. The ink was still wet when he handed the pen to Amelia. She signed her name beneath his. Amelia Linden. Soon to be written as Amelia Pendleton. 10 minutes later, they were inside the Duke's heavy traveling coach, leaving the church behind. The carriage wheels churned through the London mud, heading north toward Westfall Park, his ancestral estate in Northamptonshire. There would be no wedding breakfast. There would be no congratulations from the ton. Arthur had ordered the coachman to drive straight through the night. The silence inside the carriage was different from the silence before. It was alive now, thick with the reality of what they had just done. Amelia sat on her side of the carriage, her massive satin skirt filling the small space between them, brushing against Arthur's trousers. He sat opposite her, his arms folded across his chest, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. The gray light of the afternoon caught the harsh lines of his face, the broken bridge of his nose, the straight, unyielding line of his mouth. "You should remove that veil," Arthur said after they had passed the toll gate at Islington. "It makes you look like a ghost." Amelia reached up and unpinned the lace, tossing it onto the seat beside her. She drew a long, deep breath of the damp air. "I feel somewhat like one. Am I to congratulate myself, Your Grace? I went to bed expecting to marry a mister and woke up a duchess." "You may congratulate your father," Arthur said coldly, without looking at her. "His skin is saved. Your family will retain their house, and the collieries will be functional by the spring. As for yourself, you have married a man who has no time for games, Amelia. If you expected a husband who would write you sonnets and escort you to Almack's every Wednesday, you should have stayed in the carriage." Amelia let out a short, dry laugh. It was a sharp sound in the quiet coach. "Sonnets? From Christian? The only thing Christian ever wrote was a gambling voucher." "Do not insult my intelligence, Arthur. I knew exactly what your brother was, and I know what you are." Arthur turned his head slowly, his dark eyes narrowed. "Do you? You are a man who performs his duty until it kills him," she said, leaning forward slightly, the silk of her dress rustling loud in the enclosed space. "You married me today because you couldn't bear the thought of the Pendleton name being dragged through the mud by that boy. You did it for pride, and perhaps for a bit of pity for my father." Arthur stared at her. The carriage hit a rut in the road, jostling them both, but his gaze didn't waver. A strange, dark intensity flared in his eyes, something that made Amelia's skin prickle with that same heat she had felt weeks ago. "You think very little of yourself if you think I did this for your father, Amelia," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. Amelia frowned, her breath hitching. "What is that supposed to mean?" Arthur leaned back against the leather cushions, the shadows of the carriage falling across his face once more, hiding his expression. "It means that Christian was a fool who didn't know the value of the prize he held, and it means that I am not a generous man. I do not pay £20,000 of another man's debt out of pity." He closed his eyes, signaling the end of the conversation. Amelia sat back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down at the heavy gold and sapphire ring on her finger. It felt warm now, heated by her own skin. She looked back at the man sitting opposite her, her husband, the Duke, and for the first time since this madness began, she felt a cold shiver of something that wasn't dread, but something much more dangerous, hope. Westfall Park did not welcome them. It merely tolerated their arrival. The carriage wheels crunched over the gravel drive just past midnight, the rain having turned into a bitter, driving sleet. The estate loomed out of the darkness like a fortress of gray stone, its sheer walls punctuated by tall, unlit windows. There were no torches blazing in the courtyard, no line of footmen waiting to greet the new Duchess. There was only a solitary housekeeper, holding a flickering oil lamp, shivering under the portico. Arthur stepped out first. His boots sank into the freezing mud. He turned and offered his hand. Amelia took it, her heavy satin dress, now hopelessly crumpled and stained at the hem, dragged across the wet stone steps. She didn't complain about the cold. She didn't shrink from the imposing, shadow-drenched facade of her new home. She merely squared her shoulders and walked through the heavy oak doors. The entry hall smelled of beeswax, cold ash, and old armor. It was magnificent, but entirely devoid of life. "Mrs. Higgins," Arthur said, shedding his damp greatcoat and handing it to a sleepy-eyed boot boy who had just scurried up from the kitchens. "This is the Duchess of Westfall. Show her to the West Wing chambers. Have fires lit immediately." Mrs. Higgins, a gaunt woman with iron-gray hair, blinked in shock. She looked at Arthur, then at Amelia, her eyes dropping to the massive sapphire ring on Amelia's hand. She clearly knew Christian was supposed to be the groom. She just as clearly knew better than to ask questions. "Yes, Your Grace, at once." "Wait," Amelia said. Her voice cut through the cavernous hall, echoing off the marble floor. Arthur stopped halfway down the corridor, turning to look back at her. The shadows of the hallway clung to the sharp angles of his face. "Where are your chambers?" she asked. "The East Wing," Arthur replied. His tone was perfectly level, perfectly polite. A closed door. "It has been a long day, Amelia. We are both exhausted. You will have the privacy you require to adjust to your new station." He was giving her an out. He was giving her a fortress to hide in, far away from the stranger she had married. A gentlemanly concession. Amelia hated it. "I am not a guest, Arthur," she said. She let go of the housekeeper's lantern and walked toward him. Her ruined satin gown hissed against the marble. "I am your wife. If we are to manage this estate and the scandal that is undoubtedly brewing in London, I will not do it from the other side of a stone castle. Put my trunks in the adjoining room to yours, or I will sleep in the corridor." Arthur stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackle of the sleet against the high windows. For a second, Amelia thought he might order her locked in the West Wing. Instead, that ghost of a smile returned, sharper this time. "Mrs. Higgins, the adjoining rooms in the East Wing, and bring a pot of hot tea to the library." He turned and walked away. Amelia followed him into the dark. 2 hours later, the crushing weight of the day finally settled into Amelia's bones. She had stripped off the suffocating wedding dress, leaving it in a heap on the floor like a shed skin. She washed her face with cold water from a porcelain basin and pulled on a simple, dark wool wrapper. Her new bedroom was austere, dominated by a massive 4-poster bed, draped in heavy velvet. The door connecting her room to Arthur's was closed. There was no lock on her side. She stared at the heavy brass handle for a long time. Then she turned and walked out into the hall. She found him in the library. The room was immense, lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and decaying paper. A single fire roared in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the Turkish rug. Arthur was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, his cravat discarded, his collar open. A half-empty glass of amber liquid sat on the table beside him. Spread across his lap was a heavy leather ledger. Amelia stepped into the room. She didn't announce herself. She walked to the hearth, holding her hands out to the flames. The heat bit into her frozen fingers. "The Linden accounts," Arthur said without looking up. He turned a page. The paper rustled loudly. "Your father was not just careless. He was delusional. The interest on the colliery loans alone would have bankrupted him by Christmas." "I know," Amelia said softly. "I balanced his books for 3 years, until he took the keys to the desk away from me." Arthur finally looked up. His eyes dragged over her, over the simple wool wrapper, her unbound hair falling over her shoulders, the bare skin of her neck illuminated by the firelight. The air in the room seemed to suddenly thicken. The civilized distance he had maintained in the carriage began to fracture. He closed the ledger with a heavy thud and tossed it onto the table. "You said earlier," Amelia began, turning to face him, "that you did not pay my father's debts out of pity. You said you were not a generous man." Arthur didn't move. He sat in the chair, a dark, imposing figure, watching her with the stillness of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "I did say that." "Then why?" she demanded. She took a step toward him. "Why step into the chapel? Why tether yourself to a ruined family? If it wasn't for the Pendleton pride, and it wasn't for pity, what was it, Arthur? Tell me the truth. Do not treat me like a child who needs protecting from the world's harsh realities." "I am already standing in the ashes." Arthur picked up his glass. He took a slow, deliberate swallow. The firelight caught the amber liquid, casting a brief, fiery reflection across his jaw. "3 months ago," he said, his voice low, scraping against the quiet of the room. "We were at the Cavendish ball. You wore a dark green dress. It rained. The terrace doors were open." Amelia frowned, searching her memory. She remembered the night. Christian had abandoned her to dance with a young widow. She had stood by the doors, watching the storm, feeling entirely invisible. "Christian left you standing there for an hour," Arthur continued. He set the glass down. He stood up. He was suddenly too large for the room, blocking out the light of the fire. He walked toward her, his boots silent on the thick rug. "You didn't cry. You didn't look for him. You just watched the rain. You looked like a woman calculating exactly how much air she needed to survive underwater." He stopped inches from her. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. The scent of him, wood smoke, whiskey, and clean, hot skin wrapped around her. "I watched you," Arthur said, the words rough, pulled from somewhere deep in his chest. "I watched him ignore you. I watched him treat the most intelligent, formidable woman in London like an unwanted obligation, and I wanted to kill him." Amelia stopped breathing. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "I didn't take my brother's place today, Amelia," Arthur whispered, his dark eyes burning into hers. The stoic, unfeeling Duke was gone. In his place was a man stripped to the bone, raw and uncompromising. "I took what I've wanted since the moment I saw you. I bought your father's debt last week." "All of it," Amelia gasped, stepping back. You held the notes?" "If Christian had gone through with the wedding, he would have found his allowance cut to nothing, and I would have held the leash to your family's survival. I would have kept you close. I would have made sure you never wanted for anything, even if I had to watch you belong to him." He closed the distance between them again, crowding her, his presence overwhelming. "But he ran. The coward ran. And he gave you to me." Amelia stared at the man before her. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of his obsession washed over her. He hadn't rescued her. He had orchestrated a net, and she had fallen straight into it. She should have been horrified. She should have run to the West Wing and locked the door. Instead, a wild, fierce heat bloomed in the center of her chest. She had spent her entire life being a pawn, a piece moved across the board by weak men trying to save themselves. Her father, Christian, but Arthur had not moved her. He had cleared the entire board just to stand beside her. "You are a monster," Amelia whispered. The words hung in the air between them. They weren't an accusation. They were a recognition. Arthur's jaw tightened. He reached up, his rough fingers hovering just an inch from the side of her face. The heat radiating from his hand made her skin shiver. I am a man who protects what is his, and you, Amelia, are mine. By law, by contract, and by the blood in my veins. You belong to me. I am not a colliery, Arthur, she said, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with an adrenaline so sharp it tasted like copper on her tongue. I am not a line on a ledger you can balance out. I know exactly what you are. His fingers finally closed the distance, tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark, jarring contrast to the violence of his words. You are the only real thing in a world of ghosts and hypocrites. You look at me and you do not see the title. You do not see the bank accounts. You see me. Amelia leaned into his hand. The contact sent a jolt of pure electricity straight down her spine. The cold pragmatism that had armored her for years cracked, splitting wide open. When Christian fled, she murmured, her eyes locking onto his, my father wept. He told me our lives were over. He told me my only hope was that you would take pity on us. Arthur's thumb brushed over her lower lip. And what did you think? I thought my prayers had finally been answered, she confessed. The air rushed out of Arthur's lungs in a harsh exhale. His composure shattered. He didn't hesitate. He pulled her against him, his hands sliding around her waist, crushing her body to his. The kiss was not polite. It was not a gentle exploration of a new bride. It was a collision. It was months of silent, bitter restraint finally breaking. His mouth was hot, demanding, taking possession of her with a desperate, crushing intensity that made her head spin. Amelia didn't pull away. She grabbed the lapels of his shirt, her fingers twisting into the linen, pulling him closer. She opened her mouth to him, matching his desperation with a fierce, ravenous hunger of her own. She tasted the whiskey on his tongue, felt the heavy, frantic thud of his heart against her chest. He backed her toward the heavy mahogany desk. Her hips hit the edge of the wood, scattering a pile of blank parchment onto the floor. Arthur didn't care. He swept his arm across the surface, clearing the inkwells and quills with a loud clatter, and lifted her onto the desk. He stepped between her knees, his hands moving up her sides, tracing the curve of her ribs beneath the thin wool wrapper. Amelia. He groaned against her throat, his breath hot against her skin. God, Amelia, I will give you everything. I will burn London to the ground if they ever speak a word against you. I don't care about London, she breathed, threading her hands into his thick, dark hair. Oh, she pulled his face back up to hers. I don't care about the ton. They can drown in their own gossip. I only care about this. Show me. He looked at her, his dark eyes completely unguarded, blazing with a terrifying, absolute devotion. There were no more secrets between them, no more contracts, no more shadows. He untied the sash of her wrapper. The heavy wool parted, exposing the thin white chemise beneath. The firelight played across her skin. Arthur looked at her as if she were the only light left in the world. He pressed his lips to the hollow of her collarbone, his hands smoothing over her hips, heavy and sure. Every touch was a claim. Every kiss was a vow he intended to keep in blood. They did not make it to the East Wing that night. They stayed in the library, surrounded by the heavy ledgers and the decaying history of the Pendleton name, and they built something entirely new in the ashes. It was raw. It was grounded in sweat, in sharp intakes of breath, in the desperate tangling of limbs, on the thick Turkish rug. It was entirely human. When morning finally broke, gray and quiet over the Northamptonshire countryside, Amelia woke on the rug. The fire had died down to glowing red embers. Arthur was sitting beside her, fully awake, his coat draped over her bare shoulders to keep off the chill. He was watching her. Amelia shifted, the dull ache in her muscles, a visceral reminder of the night. She pulled his coat tighter around her and sat up, her shoulder brushing his arm. They will be printing the papers in London right now, Arthur said quietly. His voice was gravelly, relaxed. The heavy tension that had always lived in his shoulders was gone. They will call it a scandal. They will say you were humiliated. Amelia looked at the heavy gold and sapphire ring on her finger. The light of the dawn hit the dark stone, She reached out and placed her hand over his. His fingers immediately intertwined with hers, his grip solid and unbreakable. "Let them talk, Arthur," she said, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. "They are playing a game. But we own the board." Arthur brought her knuckles to his lips and kissed them, his eyes dark and shining with a fierce, triumphant pride. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Westfall had everything he wanted, and he would never, ever let it go. Did you love this unexpected twist of fate? If Amelia and Arthur's slow burn romance captured your heart, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button and share this story with fellow historical drama lovers who crave real, gritty, and passionate romance. Your support helps bring more of these grounded, breathless tales to life. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter. What should happen to Christian? Let me know in the comments below.